Hello friends, welcome to my channel Literary Discussion, and today we are going to discuss literary forms. What are the major forms in English literature and the introduction to literary forms. That's what we are going to see in this presentation. The content of or objective of this presentation is two. The first one is the introduction to literary forms. What is form? What is literary form? And what are the major forms available in English literature? And then we have three major forms. One is poetry, prose, and drama. And we are going to discuss poetry in elaborate in this presentation, the nature of poetry and the division of poetry, and all these things we are going to discuss in this presentation. And first one, definition of literary forms. What is form? A fixed pattern of something. And application form, scholarship form, and what the PhD application form. And we have many things. A form means a fixed pattern of something. And what is literary form? The form of any piece of writing is simply its structure and organized. Yes, in all the forms in English literature, it has its own structure and it is organized according to that structure. So literary forms is the basic, and it is not for the examination purpose. One who want to master over literature, he must be familiar with all the literary forms and genres which is available in English literature. And literary forms are roots to the literary family tree and literature. And the major division in literary forms, I told you, three major divisions. One is poetry, and poetry is the ancient and the earliest form of literature. And then prose, a easy and powerful form in literature. And then drama, a unique form of literature. Why drama is unique? Because it is the only form which can be enacted on the stage. And not only that, the drama is in the form of dialogue, a conversation. That is the uniqueness of this particular form. That is why it is very famous. And poetry, one of the oldest of the literary forms. It can be broadly divided into two types: subjective poetry and objective poetry. And before we get into the division or classification of poetry, and we must know what are the characteristics of poetry and the definition of poetry. We cannot define poetry in a particular circle. There are tons and tons of definitions are there for poetry. So I have given, and very simply, I have given one definition, a simple definition. Poetry is the expression of the experience of an individual. To put it very simply, it is the expression of one's own experience. That experience may be physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. So this is the very simple definition of poetry. And there are many writers, the scholars, they have defined poetry beautifully. I have picked up very few writers and for your reference. The first one, Dr. Samuel Johnson, one of the greatest literary figure, a literary giant, literary dictator, and one of the greatest critic, Samuel Johnson. He defined poetry as it is a metrical composition. And it must unite pleasure with truth. Yes, obviously, poetry means what? A metrical composition, and it should be arranged at some metrical and level. Then only it inspires the readers. And not only that, the aim of any poem or the aim of poetry is to provide pleasure. The first and foremost aim of poetry is to provide pleasure. And so and it must unite pleasure with truth. And according to Johnson, yes, the instruction is next. First it must make the readers happy. And then the next one, William Wordsworth, one of the very famous figure in English literature. He is the founder, pioneer of romantic poetry, romantic school of poetry. and he defined this. This definition is very famous and everyone knows in the literature department. And what? The spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. What is poetry? Spontaneous and without any friction. It comes and without any struggle, friction, and it's like a thought process. So spontaneous overflow of not ordinary feelings but of powerful feelings. Then general characteristics of poetry. So poetry has much to do with feelings and imagination. Yes, and to put it very simple, poetry means it's an imaginative expression. So poetry interprets life through imagination and feelings. But imagination and feelings alone may not produce poetry, because we may find lot of poetry in some prose writings. And similarly, some poetry may also appear to be prosaic. And poetry differs from other forms of literature in the matter of choosing the subject matter and handling it. Poetry has its aim. What is the aim? To provide pleasure. And meter and rhymes will contribute to achieve this aim. And meter appeals to the feelings. And when the words are arranged in a metrical order, they gain a new meaning and power that can appeal our emotion, that can win the heart of the audience. Hence, the meter is a powerful aid in the emotionalization of the thought. And one more thing, and poet and his poetry is are inseparable. We cannot separate and the poet and poetry. His choice of subject will show us and what he is. And when we read a poem, we read the poet. His choice of subject itself. And what? Take for an example John Milton. And what kind of poem he writes, or what kind of writing? It is a didactic writing. When you read the sonnet of Milton, when you read the only one epic poem in English literature, Paradise Lost by Milton, and you could smell the religious, and yes, he is the man who he's a Puritan. So his writings, it is filled with the religious smell and the morality, I can say. So the choice of subject itself identify what kind of writer he is. And when we read a poem, we read the poetess. When you read Milton, and when you read Paradise Lost, you can read the Milton. What is in the mind of the Milton? So according to Coleridge, a great poet is also a great philosopher. Yes, and obviously, and the great poet is great. That is why Plato, Aristotle, and so all they were the philosophers, and they were very good poets also. And poetry is an interpretation of life, the life of nature and the life of humanity, though imagination and feelings. A poet not only sees, feels, but also with his power of imagination makes us to see and feel. So its power to reveal is the chief elementary of poetry. So whatever I observe, I write it, and what I felt, I make the millions of readers to felt the same. So that is the power of the poetry. A poetry has the power to change the whole community. And so poetry is the powerful medium. That is why on those days, and in all the revolution, and people, they have started to write poem, and they induce the heart and mind of the people. Then the division of poetry, and we have two division. One is subjective poetry and objective poetry, as we discussed earlier. And the first form, subjective poetry. What is subjective poetry? Subjective poetry is also called a personal poetry, in which a poet portrays himself and expresses his own self. So it is purely a personal I. And then objective poetry. Objective poetry is impersonal. It is called the poetry of representation or creation, and he completely isolate, or completely he exile from himself, and he write it as a common man, and he never mingles his own likes and dislikes in that particular poem. And here I have listed a few major forms in subjective poetry. The first one is the lyric, and then the sonnet, and the ode and elegy. And lyric is a short poem which expresses the poet's thoughts and feelings, Originally, the Greek lyric was sung to the accompany of lyre. Lyre is a musical instrument. The sonnet form, as you know, it is a very it is one of the very famous form of 14 line. The word is a dignified composition. Elegy, it is a sad song. We are going to discuss each and every form very detailed in the forthcoming videos. And objective poetry, the epic. Epic means, you know, and the epic is a long narrative poem. It deals with the universal theme and universal hero, and so a highly polished language, and so it sings the exploits of a heroic personality. Never discuss the ordinary people, the heroic people. And then folk song, a traditional lyrical poem of fixed form. And then ballad is a narrative poem. It presents a dramatic episode, and it generally relates the story of love and war. The finest English ballads were composed between 1350 and 1550. They came from southern Scotland and northern England. It arises out of folk literature. It is of native growth. So this is ballad. And then idyll, the term refers to the verse that depicts and celebrates the pastoral virtuals and scenes. So idyll means a pictorial quality. So these are all the major forms in objective poetry. And so thank you so much for your listening, and kindly support me by subscribing my channel. Thank you. We will see in another presentation. Thank you so much.